Welcome to Baden Hill. Let the good times roll. At the end of World War I, with the Treaty of Versailles and the increasing power of the United States, many in the United States thought that the good times were going to be rolling. And so began the Roaring 1920s. The Roaring 20s were roaring. Many things were roaring. The economy, culture, technology, and new freedoms that people gained because of the experience of World War I. There were also scars. We can't forget the Spanish flu epidemic, and all of those lost in the war, and the vacuum that created in U.S. society. So, in this first segment of this unit, which is called Blues, we want to talk about a very important cultural phenomenon that developed during the war and really took effect once the war had ended. And it's connected to the war. And this is Prohibition. Prohibition comes from the word prohibit, which means to forbid or outlaw something. And prohibition specifically refers here to the prohibition or outlawing of alcoholic beverages. Now, you might think that banning alcohol is a little bit extreme, especially as we look around in our world today. We see all kinds of advertisements on television and in magazines. It's a big part of our culture. And at the same time, we see the negative effects of abuse of alcohol. There are things like drunk driving or alcoholism that are a plague in our society. So I want you to just kind of go back in time and walk in the shoes of people who saw what alcohol sometimes produced. In the 1800s, there was a movement called the Temperance Movement. Now, temperance is the idea that you can temper your behavior. That means to regulate it or make it less extreme. And so temperance is actually a Christian quality that we call self-control. And the temperance movements of the 1800s were largely led by Christian groups, and sometimes by groups of women who saw their families torn apart because of alcohol abuse. And so temperance societies were created, and they wanted to ban alcohol, at least on certain days of the week, like Sunday. They wanted to limit the effects of alcohol. Unfortunately, that movement didn't create change right away. And so the people in those groups, they said, we can't just limit alcoholic beverages. We need to get rid of them altogether. And some Christian groups were especially against any use of alcohol. And those groups gradually gained momentum over the 1800s. And because of all the social problems of the late 1800s, you had, remember, the Gilded Age, which was a lot of rich people getting richer, but you also had poor people staying poor and sometimes getting even more poor. And because of those social problems, people thought that if you got rid of alcohol, that some of these poor people wouldn't be taken advantage of. And the alcohol was creating a situation where they became addicted, and then they couldn't do anything to help themselves. They would lose their jobs. Sometimes they would be injured in accidents in factories because of the influence of alcohol. The places where people lived, where poor people were struggling to survive and they were living in crowded conditions, if alcohol was abused and there was violence, that spread to the entire community. And so poverty was connected with alcohol. And as a result, there was an amendment proposed to the Constitution. And you might, again, think that this is kind of extreme, but it was all connected to the desire to be progressive. So progressivism, which we discussed earlier, and prohibition are closely related. The idea was if you regulate alcohol, you can be progressive and create progress in society and help poor people be able to make a better living and get out of poverty. So the amendment to the Constitution eventually gained enough popularity, and one of the main reasons was because during World War I, there was a great deal of alcohol abuse in the military, and when soldiers came back from war, remember they had to deal with the things that they had seen and the injuries they had suffered, and they often turned to medicine in the form of alcohol to forget their problems. And so the people at home, they saw that this was a terrible social problem, and eventually there was enough support, and they passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which controlled and prohibited the sale and production and transportation of alcohol. But that didn't mean that, in fact, it prohibited intoxicating beverages, but it didn't define what those were. Because there are different kinds of alcohol, and basically it has to do with percentage. Higher the percentage, the stronger it is. And so Congress needed to respond to the amendment, and they needed to create legislation, a law that would define what happened as a result of the 18th Amendment and going against that amendment. And so the Volstead Act was passed by Congress. But President Wilson vetoed the act, largely because it was happening during the war and at the end of the war, and it seemed to be causing a problem for the president in carrying out the war. So he vetoed it, but Congress passed the Volstead Act over his veto in October 27th, 1919. I remember that date because it's my son's birthday. So the Volstead Act gave punishments that would be given out for breaking the guidelines of the 18th Amendment. And power was also given to local governments to have penalties and laws related to protecting the 18th Amendment. And so things changed. Society in the United States changed dramatically because of the Volstead Act. One thing that changed and became a problem was the use of alcohol in religious ceremonies. And religious groups, Catholics, Lutherans, many groups, Jews, had wine as a part of their religious ceremonies. And now it was going to be very difficult, even a conflict between religion and government. This is headed for trouble. And so because alcohol was a part of people's cultural backgrounds and religious backgrounds, you can see that there will be a lot of people who don't agree with the law or the amendment. And so basically they ignored it. And they started to use alcohol and find alcohol illegally. And this is really difficult for Christians because, again, Christians wanted to make the world better and have progress and get rid of poverty. But as a result, you're actually pushing Christians to break the law, because having wine for communion, for example, is something that became a conflict, or just as a part of family gatherings and weddings, as it is in the Bible. And so what happened is you had the illegal sale of alcohol, and alcohol couldn't be produced officially, so you had illegal alcohol produced even in people's homes, and it was called bootlegging. And so it's kind of a funny term, but it just basically means that you are creating your own alcohol. And it could, people learned how to make alcohol in their backyards with machinery that they set up, and they could create it from grains and fruits and things that would ferment. So that was bootlegging, and there were places that sprang up around neighborhoods and cities called speakeasies. And it was a secret place that wasn't really very secret. And you'd go and you'd knock, and then a little window would open, and you would say a password, and you'd go in, and it would be like a bar or a restaurant with alcohol being sold illegally. And so bootlegging and speakeasies were a part of the Roaring '20s. Now, because basically everybody is ignoring this law, and still you had organized crime that benefited from the illegal sale of alcohol. So many gangsters were making a lot of money. People started to say that the 18th Amendment was unfair. And again, it's going back and forth, and there's a tug of war over this cultural institution. And gradually, there was enough support to pass another amendment in 1933, after the Roaring '20s were over and the Great Depression had begun and developed. The 21st Amendment was passed in 1933, ending Prohibition. But the amazing thing is that you still have the 18th Amendment in our Constitution. It doesn't disappear. And so you have the 18th Amendment, which establishes prohibition against alcohol. And then you have the 21st Amendment, which repeals or gets rid of the 18th Amendment, even though the 18th Amendment is still there. It's a fascinating reality in our U.S. government. We've already mentioned how the role of women in society was changing in the 1920s because of what happened in World War I and the fact that so many men were killed in World War I, and also women had been the ones to fill the vacuum during the war, working in factories and producing the weapons that were being used by the men. And so they were a very necessary part of the economy. Well, it didn't start with World War I or the 1920s. It actually had started earlier than that. And there is a moment that we can look at. In 1848, there was the beginning of a movement to support women. And this was called the Seneca Falls Convention. And so the Seneca Falls Convention was held in July of 1848. It's before the Civil War, and it was a gathering in New York, Seneca Falls, New York, a gathering of women, including abolitionists, and people like Frederick Douglass did come to support the issue of abolition of slavery. But the main people involved were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And those were the two most famous women's rights activists during the 1800s. And they are kind of the forerunners of many who came later, like Susan B. Anthony, and eventually we'll talk about Emmeline Pankhurst and Alice Paul. But the Seneca Falls Convention was the beginning of annual events where women would come together, and they talk about improving the life that women were having, whether religiously or economically or socially, that they weren't asking for a complete change of society overnight. And they presented themselves through ideas, and they wanted to change things politically. And so that was the beginning, the Seneca Falls Convention. And it would lead eventually to more and more discussion of women getting the right to vote. And this is called suffrage. Suffer, if you go back to the King James Bible, Jesus says to his disciples, "Suffer the little children unto me." And he's not saying cause children to suffer. He's saying allow the children to come to me. So suffrage means to allow. And specifically here, it's to allow someone to vote. Now, Susan B. Anthony was also influenced by this Seneca Falls movement, and eventually she would probably be the most famous of the women's rights leaders during the second half of the 1800s. And specifically, she was fighting against slavery. We've already said that those two movements were closely related, the women's rights movement and the abolition movement. And so Susan B. Anthony became famous. Eventually, long after her life ended, in 1979, I remember this as a child, her face appeared on the silver dollar. And so there were Susan B. Anthony dollars. She was the first woman whose image was put on a U.S. coin. And so that was pretty special. So we've already discussed the fact that when all those men started going away to war in 1914, if you were in England, in the UK, men were going off to war. The women then had to take the men's jobs. And so that continued in the United States. The men started going off to war in 1917. And immediately that gave women more power in society. And the desire for, again, temperance and prohibition, but also suffrage, that gained momentum. And during the war, women were not only producing things in factories and replacing men, but they were actually serving as nurses, and we've already discussed that in our talk about World War I and women's contributions. So women were gaining status because of their significance and the things that they had done, which is kind of ridiculous. We know that that's ridiculous because women have always been equally important to men, and we, as a society, we have failed so often to protect the rights of women. So during the war, there was increased status for women, and then with the effects of the Spanish flu, that made it even more pronounced. You had this, and honestly, in any population, you have more women than men, and that's just a reality. So that was becoming more and more pronounced. You have two leaders then who emerge in the early 1900s and into the First World War. And that was Emmeline Pankhurst and Alice Paul. Now, Emmeline Pankhurst was kind of the forerunner. In the late 1800s, Emmeline Pankhurst developed a reputation for being very aggressive and saying, we want actions, not words. And as a result, she joined a group of women fighting for women's rights and really fighting. They actually attacked police officers and did things that were even considered violent by the society at the time. And they were put in prison, and then they went on hunger strikes. So the next stage was to refuse to eat while they were in prison. But then the authorities actually force-fed them. They forced them to eat, and it was extremely painful. And so they experienced a kind of torture in prison. And they were doing this all because they wanted the right to vote for women and other rights in society. Emmeline Pankhurst continued through her life to fight, and even some of the members of her group promoted arson. That means burning down buildings on purpose, right? And so things were pretty extreme, and Emmeline Pankhurst's daughter then took over the leadership of her women's rights organization, and was actually in England. And you need to know Emmeline Pankhurst was operating in England. A woman named Alice Paul went to study in England and heard Emmeline Pankhurst's daughter speak and had a conversion moment. Basically, she became convinced that she had to be a part of this women's movement as well. And so Alice Paul joined this movement for women's suffrage. And again, it's ironic that you are trying to get suffrage, but you end up suffering so much. So Alice Paul was put in prison, but she led a group called the Silent Sentinels. And sentinels are like guards. And what she did is she led protests at the White House. She also led a parade in Washington, D.C. on the day before President Wilson was to be inaugurated. And this is the kind of thing that is still happening today. A president's inauguration sometimes leads to other political protests right around the same time. And so Alice Paul and others led a parade down the street, and there was a famous woman who was a lawyer, and she sat in a white dress on a white horse, and the people who saw this said that it was one of the most beautiful spectacles, most beautiful parades in American history. Okay, and so the Silent Sentinels continued their pressure at the White House even into the wartime. And sometimes they were put in prison because they were seen as being traitors to their country and not patriotic. But you need to know that, Emmeline Pankhurst, she basically supported the war effort against Germany in Britain and suspended some of the activities that she had been doing and changed from her violent protests to being supportive of the soldiers going overseas. But that actually helped to gain the vote after the war was over. In England, women did gain the right to vote. And if you were 21, then you could vote if you were a man, but you had to be 30 if you were a woman. And this was because so many men had died, and people were afraid that because there were so many women, that if you had the same age for voting, that women would have a disproportionate influence in society. So in the United States, finally, because of the work of Alice Paul and others, the 19th Amendment was passed, finally ratified in 1920, and began the Roaring Twenties with more freedom and influence for women. So remember that one of the main side effects of Prohibition was not that people stopped drinking. It was that criminals realized they could make a whole lot of money by selling alcohol illegally. And this was even true with government leaders. Everybody was ignoring the law of Prohibition. And there's a story that in Detroit, you actually had a government raid on a speakeasy where alcohol was being sold. And the police came and they caught the mayor and the sheriff and also the local congressman, all in the speakeasy illegally enjoying alcohol. And why Detroit? And why Chicago? Well, these cities were actually right across the border from Canada, and organized crime knew that they could produce the alcohol or get the alcohol in Canada and smuggle it across the border to Detroit and Chicago. And so what you've got is organized crime, and you have mob bosses. It's like a corporation. They are on top, and they have all these employees, and they are breaking the law together in a very organized way. And there are symbols from this period related to the gangsters and these mobs. And the Tommy gun is one of the most famous. Remember that machine guns were developed as a terrible weapon for World War I, but then they got more and more advanced, and eventually machine guns were on the streets of America, and they were called Tommy guns. And they also they were used by gangsters, but gangsters also used cars called Duesenbergs. Duesenbergs were fancy cars, luxury cars, very innovative, that had been developed in the early 1910s. And so what would happen is gangsters would pile into a Duesenberg, and then they would drive by a place where there was a rival gang or somebody who wasn't obeying them, and they would shoot their Tommy gun out the window. You've maybe seen this in bad crime movies from the 1920s, or making fun of that. So organized crime was about racketeering, and racketeering means controlling something by force, controlling illegal things by force. And one of the things that organized criminals did is they went to regular businesses, bakeries, butchers, anybody in town, and they would say, you need to pay us some money so that we protect you from the gangsters. Well, the bakers and the butchers, they weren't being threatened by any gangsters except the ones who wanted to give them protection. And so it was basically a way of saying, unless you pay us, we will hurt you. And so it was called protection money. And basically all the businesses in a city or a town, they had to pay the gangsters to have protection from the people who would hurt them. And those were the same people who were protecting them. So finally, the government started using some of the same tactics as the criminals. And they realized that they had to create their own gang. And there was a gang that was created called the Untouchables. And it was led by a man named Eliot Ness. And he was, a police officer, and he was fed up with the gangsters and criminals getting away with everything. People like Al Capone were getting away with murder, literally. And, events like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, there are all kinds of terrible events that happened that basically are linked back to Al Capone, but he was never convicted for those crimes. But Eliot Ness was basically trying to get Al Capone. And this was all happening in Chicago, which was probably the worst place for organized crime. But Omaha, Nebraska actually was a bad place for organized crime too. Kind of strange fact of history. So in Chicago, there's this battle between Eliot Ness and the Untouchables and Al Capone. And eventually, Al Capone made a mistake. His accountant had been trying to make it look like Al Capone's money was all coming from legal sources. But the police were able to arrest the accountant. And then they had to protect him because all the gangsters want to kill the accountant before he testifies in a trial. But eventually Al Capone was convicted, not of murder or stealing or selling alcohol illegally. He was convicted for income tax evasion. And he was sent to Alcatraz because the judges, they all knew that he was this terrible criminal. He was sent to Alcatraz, and that is where he eventually died. So that's the story of organized crime during the Roaring '20s. Now, one thing that you can't not discuss about the 1920s is culture. All of these changes in society, increased rights for women, had a huge impact on how Americans saw themselves and how people all over the world saw themselves. People wanted peace. They were tired of war. And as the economy started developing positively, people realized that they could do things that they had never done before, like traveling and buying things that made their life more interesting to them. And so one group of people you need to talk about immediately are the flappers. The flappers were women, certain groups of women who had a certain fashion during the Roaring '20s. And the word flapper, possibly it comes from their dance moves, because you had dances like the Charleston, where women dancers and men too were flapping their arms like birds. But there's evidence that it could have been because of the kind of dresses that they were wearing, or even their hairstyle, that it wasn't put up in the old-fashioned way, but it was kind of flapping a little bit. So women who used this fashion, and often they would have a kind of a knit cap that was close to their head, and that was a symbol too of this style. They were seen as being very different and challenging social rules. For example, they smoked. Now, men had been smoking for hundreds of years, but women hadn't been smoking. So we know smoking is a terrible thing for our health, and it was simply that women were feeling that they should be able to do what men had done, and that included drinking alcohol and dancing and things like that, and being independent, traveling independently. And so, as I mentioned, this is something that it came out of this new freedom, and people were traveling to new places. And so you had exchanges between Europe and the United States more than ever before. And so the culture of the 1920s, particularly this flapper culture, it spread across the Atlantic. One of the most famous designers of this time, a cultural icon, was Coco Chanel. You may have heard of Chanel perfume. The Chanel brand is a very, very important brand in fashion even today. And Coco Chanel designed clothing and accessories like purses and jewelry and things like that. And she was very successful. She was French, and eventually, as her life developed, remember that France was taken over during World War II by the Nazis. There was some evidence that maybe she was a little bit too comfortable with those occupiers. And so her reputation suffered a little bit because of her cooperation with the Germans. But she was extremely influential, and she helped women see that they had the right to their own style. Another person that was very influential during the 1920s was F. Scott Fitzgerald. He actually gave a name to the 1920s. He called it the Jazz Age because of this new music from the African American community in places like Harlem and Chicago and Detroit and New Orleans and Kansas City. Jazz had developed, and so F. Scott Fitzgerald called this the Jazz Age. And he also wrote a very famous book called The Great Gatsby, which is the story of the 1920s. It's the story of how everyone was kind of going crazy and spending money and making money and living a very extravagant lifestyle, no matter how they began their life. Even if they had been very poor at their birth, they could make a lot of money and achieve the American dream. Another writer who was important was T.S. Eliot. I always remember T.S. Eliot because if you scramble the letters of his name, it becomes toilets. So T.S. Eliot is kind of the father of poetry during this time, and his style was called modernism, and he didn't use rhyming poetry. He wrote using many images and phrases, and his poetry was often hard to understand, but usually had deep meaning, and sometimes talked about the negative things that had happened because of World War I, because of all these changes in society as people were chasing after things and they had lost their values in life. He actually did become a strong Christian in his life, and it's reflected in his poetry. And finally, we need to talk about the Avant-Garde. Avant-Garde basically means on the edge or at the front of everybody else, doing things before other people do them. And so there were many artists. Think of Picasso. Think of people who did art in ways that were really strange at the time, but then it eventually caught on. And the avant-garde artists wanted to change the way that art was seen. And often they create some very weird stuff. And they didn't care about making money, at least that's what they said. Now, finally, we need to talk about this roaring economy. The Roaring 20s saw the growth of many streets in New York City in particular. Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue. Those were the places where people were living in mansions in the city because they had made a ton of money from Wall Street. Wall Street was the stock market, and people were investing in the stock market as the economy roared to life after the war. And remember, in the United States, the economy was actually driven by the war, and this production of weapons then became the production of automobiles and the mass production of people like Henry Ford. So there was this massive post-war economic expansion. When we say an economic expansion, it means the GDP, the gross domestic product, is going up, 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 up. And that means the country as a whole is making more money. People have jobs. There's a low rate of unemployment. And so this is the economic expansion after the war and because of the war. And for the first time, people were allowed to buy things on credit. Now, they didn't have credit cards like we have today, no plastic credit cards, but they had the ability to go into a store and say, I will pay this much per month for this many months. And they could actually take home a new thing right away, whether it was a car or these new appliances that were developing. And so consumer credit also was represented on Wall Street. On Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange was allowing people to buy on credit. They could buy on the margin. And that basically meant they could borrow money to buy stocks. And the idea for a stock exchange is you want to buy shares of a company. It's like a club, and everybody in the club has a part of the ownership of the club. And if the club makes money, everybody makes money because they have a share in it, and they share the profits. And so people would go and they would buy shares. Now, not everybody went to the stock market. You'd have traders who represented individual customers. And basically, you want to buy at a low price, and then you hope that the price will go up. And the interesting thing is when everybody is buying, that makes the price go up. And so many times, stock prices are artificial. They're only going up because everybody is buying shares. And suddenly, if people realize, whoops, too many people bought and there's nothing happening from this company, then the price will start to fall, and then people will sell, and that will make the price go down even faster. So the prices of stocks are based on what people think a company will do. It's kind of like a restaurant that you might pass on the street. If you see everybody eating there, you might think it's a good restaurant and you'll go in. But then people might discover, oh, wait a minute, it's not really a good restaurant, and everybody gets food poisoning. So that's where we're headed. It's a bubble that keeps blowing up bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can see that eventually this economic bubble is going to burst. We'll talk about that in another video. Thanks for watching.